Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Aquatic Plants Emerging Threats in Ecology session. And our first speakers today will be Lauren Henderson and Chris Williams. Lauren is the AIS coordinator for the Capital Region Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. She is formerly a watercraft inspection steward and a program manager of Watercraft Inspection Steward Program at AWI, the Adirondack Watershed Institute. Chris is the coordinator of the Capital Region Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. Chris's work focuses on both terrestrial and aquatic species, along with sustainability and restoration. Today, Lauren and Chris will be talking about emerging species of concern, flowering rush, and watercress.
All right, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Kathy and Amy, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we have you.
Good, and is my presentation in full mode and properly displayed?
You're good.
All right, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. This is a great time to maybe grab your coffee or tea and sit back and do a little learning, like show and tell, a little break from some of the more technical reports that some of you have been sitting through over the last couple of days, which were fantastic. Lauren and I are both going to talk a little bit about two emerging species today. We want to bring some attention and awareness to them, and that's our purpose. I will speak about watercress, and then Lauren is going to speak about flowering rush, excuse me. Again, we're both from the Invasive Species Management Prism from the Capital Region. We're hosted by the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Saratoga County. All right, I need to move something here. All right, sorry about that. All right, so watercress. This is an interesting species. It is a fast-growing vascular form. It flowers and has seed production. It's an aquatic or semi-aquatic perennial that is often found immersed in shallow areas near shorelines and typically grows in thick colonies. It's been around for some time. Introduced from Europe, temperate Asia, and Africa. Its dispersal is intentional through the green industry. You can still purchase watercress today at your grocery store. It's commonly mixed in with some of your spring salads and spring mixes. Once released into the environment, the unintentional spread can be from wind, water, animals, and humans. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. And the propagal pressures tend to be rather high with this species. Watercress is part of the mustard family. So it's rolled into that same common group of greens, kales, turnips, and radishes. And it is problematic like our fellow garlic mustard. And there are some features of watercress that kind of remind me a little bit of garlic mustard. The other thing with this plant, it does have a defense mechanism. It releases a couple of chemicals, and so that it may not be browsed on by some of our invertebrates in our aquatic settings. It should be noted, though, humans eat this, and it is also believed that there is wildlife, herbivores, such as rabbits and deers, that will browse on this species, but there isn't a lot of research or documentation to what extent. In the aquatic environment, it is believed that a lot of the invertebrates are not munching on it until after the leaves tend to pass. So there isn't the competition that you would expect between those two different insects versus mammals. All right, the habitat. It's basically found in cold alkaline waters or springs. It is a sun lover. It needs the sun. It is not shade tolerant. It's found basically in a wide range of soil and site conditions, such as sandy, loamy, or clay soils, with pHs ranging from acidic to basic. So again, it thrives in full sun conditions. It tends to prefer wet soil and it can grow in the water. It typically is not found in dry sites. So places that are common for its growth. You will see it roadside ditches, sorry. It's found in fens, forest fens, stream sides, and natural areas. And typically speaking, the populations of infestations of this species are rather small. They're typically found in less than a quarter acre, and that's confirmed from research and in-site observations. And it does establish readily in disturbed areas. The photos in the slide here are kind of interesting. You can see you know, in the picture on the left, the watercress can grow in those thick mats, and it can disrupt the hydrologic flow of a stream, especially with spring runoffs and things like that. The picture to the far right was a picture that I took locally from Niskayuna. You can see what's remarkable about the picture is the photograph was taken on April 12th in mid to upstate New York. So here you have none of the other plants have budded out yet. There is no other deciduous growth at this point. There are still snowbanks on the ground, temperatures at or below freezing at night, and you can see the growth, the emergent growth there in this favorable situation. This is in a forest to swamp fen kind of area, and I have concerns about how extensive this comes and goes. It doesn't last as long or persist because then the trees push out their leaves, and then the conditions aren't favorable for its growth to remain throughout the year. The picture in the middle, I discovered this plant in 2018. I was in a hemlock forest stand in November. There was ice in the side rills and streams, and the plant was growing underneath the ice and off to the sides. And I took a picture at the time, and I was kind of shocked to see such vibrant growth in such cold conditions. This is taken in late November. The leaves were already gone for the season. Fall had passed, you know, and we're pushing into meteorological winter. And here's this plant growing. And at the time, I was kind of looking at more of a terrestrial plant. I documented, and it took me quite a while of asking certain groups of people what they thought the plant was. And finally, I found the right person who said, you know, Chris, that looks like watercress. And so back in 2018, that was the point that it finally came to my attention that, okay, there's this odd plant that's showing up in strange places at a specific time of the year. For identification purposes, the succulent hollow branch stems, they can be rather large. You know, they can grow up to 50 to 200 centimeters in height. The actual stem itself can be 20 millimeters in diameter. And the leaves can be rather large too, 27 centimeters in length. And I have seen the plant grow to different sizes depending on the conditions. Sometimes the stems are shorter, sometimes they're taller. And the other thing is the plant sometimes tends to lay down in the soft, muddy sediments, and it will grow horizontally along some of the, you know, the riparian areas where the water and the mud meet. At other times, it can be standing upright. So it does vary a little bit in how it's standing in the environment. The leaves are pinnately divided with 3 to 7 leaflets. Typically, there's one at the end, of course. And the leaves are 5 to 10 centimeters long and 2 to 4 centimeters wide. Now, one thing about the leaves, there is some variability in the leaf. You can see in the picture on the far left, this is how I have commonly seen the plant. It typically has that round or oval shaped appearance, but there are other times that it can have a little bit of variability. In this second picture from the left has more of the lance-shaped leaf, and I have even seen them more pointier in other areas. Again, when you go to the supermarket and you go through your spring mix, you can find these leaves for identification. And I think the third picture from the left, or the third picture towards the right, sorry, is a really good classic example of what that looks like. And again, on the far right, you see the stem, you see the beautiful little white flowers that it has. They are tiny. It's part of where the name comes from. The 4 flowers tend to be like cross-shaped, so you get the watercress. And then you can actually see the seed pods in that stem, and that would be kind of its classic stance in nature. The other thing with the leaves, they have slightly irregular leaf margins, slightly wavy. They are hairless, and the stem is also hairless. The flowers, I have never seen the species in flower personally, but basically the range is from May to October. The small white petal is about 6 millimeters long and end in terminal clusters. It is a perfect flower. It has all the male and female reproductive organs are present. The stamens are rather short. When you're comparing them to the size of the leaf, they're smaller than the leaf. The ovary kind of have a purplish green color to it. It's not always purplish green based on my observations. I think it depends on how far it is in its growing season. And the sepals are short, erect, and green. It is pollinated by bees and flies, and it is self-fertile. The fruit tends to ripen from July to October. I have never seen seed on the plant personally in the handful of times that I have observed it. And you can see from the middle picture there that the seed pods are 1/2 to 1 1/4 inches long. And the seed pod is hooked at the end. It has like a little beak, and it kind of aids in identification when you don't see the flowers. It's something to look for. And I have also torn up a box of mixed greens and seen some of those seed pods in some of our take homes from the grocery store. I am now struggling with eating greens from the store because of the invasive plant that I'm finding in there while I'm trying to be healthy. Some other things. I did a quick review of some of the invasive characteristics of the plant for the presentation today. I decided to lean on New York State invasive plant rankings that are posted on the New York Invasive Info website. The ecological impacts are not well known. It's considered a moderately ranked species in New York State. There are system-wide processes and parameters that haven't been observed or the impacts on the natural community structure. What we know is that the colonies are small and don't appear to be significant in changing the density of the vegetation layer or structures. It can have impacts on the natural community composition as related to invertebrates. When you saw the picture on the previous slide there, blanketing the water body, you can easily surmise that has an impact on the light and the penetration of early spring invertebrates. So there is concern in that area. As for its biological characteristics and dispersal, the detached stem pieces easily root and refragment and form new plants. And that's where this can be problematic. The seeds are not specifically adapted to long distance dispersal. They lack dormancy about a year. So where is this getting pushed out into the environment? Mostly tropicals, from what I understand at this point in time. And I'm wondering if the seeds if it's late with its seed production, do they just hang on long enough to get a little bit of that spring bloom for the emergent species, and then it's able to hang on. Again, it's cultivated in the food industry. It's possibly spread by fishermen that I read in one review. And its production, the seed production is just not there. And there is some research indicating that when the soils are disturbed, it's going to likely take over vegetatively and not by seeds. So, again, the disturbed soils are always prime breeding grounds for invasive species. As far as distribution, I did a little review of a couple of different programs, and I was trying to figure out, okay, how widely reported is this? And it is found in all of the states except for North Dakota and Hawaii. And that figure was a little bit old, so I'm kind of suspect if that's true or not. I couldn't find anything updated. And it is also listed by 46 states as noxious and invasive. And I have an inclination that it may be underreported in the Northeast. If you look at the Northeast segment of the USGS non-indigenous aquatic species report that I threw up real quick, no pun intended, sorry. You can see like Massachusetts, Connecticut, parts of New York State, New Hampshire, Vermont, there are low reports of this species. And then the same when I ran a filtered report through IMAP invasives. There are reports, but they're not widespread. The EDD, the EDMAPS, is a county-wide distribution. So if there's one report from one county, they shade it the whole county in, I believe. So there tends to be the possibility of some underreporting in certain parts of the Northeast. So it's good to bring to our attention. And with changing climate, it might need to be paid some attention to like how this is really impacting our spring amphiboles and other aquatic invertebrates. Management options. Didn't catch a lot of stuff on management options. I've had one person in that Niskayuna area, they actually raked out the watercress. They did some hand pulling, but it's difficult because it can reestablish from remaining plant fragments. So the timing of manual removal should be done before seed. And there should be constant checks going back and forth for its regrowth. It does grow fast. And again, when the product is removed, it should be moved far away from shoreline so it's not redistributed in those streams. I've read some stuff on smothering and water drawdowns. It can be an option. One of the other sites that I've observed this is actually in gardens. I didn't talk about that earlier, but I've seen composting at one particular site in Washington County, New York, where the person was composting right next to their garden. And I could see the watercress had infiltrated their yard and is basically found in those drainage ditches. And it wasn't extensive, but nonetheless, it's remarkable that it just has that little niche. In terms of biological management, there's no known options at this time. And when we're looking at herbicide controls, there's not a lot out there in the literature. There are some products out there that are non-selective herbicides that can be used, but of course, it's in a water environment. Permitting is always an issue, and reading the label law is important. But I think the more important part of this is the prevention and then the release of it, again, from the green industry, possibly in composting, and then distribute it through the waterways in our environment. So that is my update on watercress. If you see it, report it. And always generating some observations there to see how this item is changing in our environment. Thank you very much. Amy, I'm finished. We're going to hold off on questions till after Lauren does her presentation. So if you could switch over to Lauren, that would be great. Thank you.
Are you guys able to see my screen now?
I can see your screen, Lauren.
Okay. All right, let me just see if I can get back to seeing my screen. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Henderson. I'm going to do the second half of this presentation here on flowering rush. Flowering rush is a rush-like perennial that grows along shorelines and marsh-like habitats. You can often find it kind of interspersed with native cattails. The emergent aquatic, or I guess you could call it a semi-aquatic plant, can form dense stands. It can displace native vegetation, and it can also cause difficulty for watercraft navigation if it's growing in an area along a river or a lake that is commonly used by motorboat users. It comes from the Butomaceae family. Sorry, it's a little struggle to say that word. And it's important to note that this is separate from the Gentiaceae family, which is common with rushes and wood rushes. They look very similar, but it is separate from that family. The native range of this plant is Africa, Asia, and Eurasia. And it was actually intentionally introduced from Europe, first in the United States for ornamental gardening purposes. The first reports of this species were in St. Lawrence River area in 1897. So it has been in this area for quite some time now, but luckily it hasn't really overtaken any areas too extensively. So the habitat that this species usually grows in is usually slow-moving, shallow waters. It's going to be along riparian zones of rivers or streams. In lakes, it's going to be along the shoreline, and it's very common to find in wetlands and marsh areas. Usually, it's growing in water that's less than 2 meters deep. It can grow in water deeper, but it's not as common. And one of the important things to know about this species is its wide range of hardiness. When you look at the plant hardiness zone map from the USDA, it can grow from zone 3 to 10. So it's not just restricted to one kind of area or zone of growing in the country. It pretty much covers almost all the zones in the United States. And lastly, it is intolerant of salt or brackish water, so you're going to find it growing in freshwater lakes, riparian zones, wetlands. So for identification of this species, the stem can grow up to 1.5 meters tall. With the leaves, you're going to be looking for a basal leaf. If you take a cross section of the leaf, you're going to see it's triangular. I have a lookalike species in one of the next slides that you'll be able to see an example of that, which can make it a little bit tricky for identification. But you'll see the cross section of a triangle, and then towards the end of the leaves, up towards where it will start to flower on the stem, you'll often see a twist of the leaf at the tip. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but you can kind of see it in this top picture here, where the leaf just starts to twist right towards the top there. For the roots, I've seen these roots described as bulb-like. They have kind of a fleshy look or texture to them. And one of the most common ways that this plant actually reproduces and further grows into new areas is through rhizomes that are grown out of the roots. It also produces bulbils, which allows it to drop those bulbils and infest new areas separate from the main plant. The flowers, similar to Chris's species, it's a perfect flower. You're going to be looking for a pink flower that is usually growing in June to September. It grows in umbels, so you're going to be looking for 20 to even 50 flowers on one of those umbels. There's 3 sepal and 3 petal, and you're going to see that nice light pink color. And there are 9 stamen and 6 pistils. If this plant is not in flower, it is more difficult to ID. Like I said, in one of the next slides, I have some lookalikes, and you'll see why it can be a little bit more difficult to ID. So if you do see this flower, you're probably going to get a positive ID of it. Seeds, it does produce seeds that ripen from August to September. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any good pictures of the actual seed capsules, but it is a many-seeded capsule, and not all populations produce fertile seeds. So the main way that this plant reproduces is through the rhizomes. So these are some of the lookalikes. We have bulrush on the left, and then we have woolgrass on the right. And this is actually a plant that we found over the summer while we were surveying, and we thought possibly could have been flowering rush. And you can see that's actually a picture of Chris right there holding this leaf, as it kind of resembles that triangular cross section. It's a tiny bit blurry, but you can kind of get the idea. So that's one that is common in this area that people could easily confuse as flowering rush. So if that was in flower, that would be an easy ID, but since this picture you can see it's in seed, we were a little bit skeptical at first about that. So dispersal of the plant, wide scale, you can have dispersal through gardening. Similar to Chris's plant, the watercress, it is sold still. I was doing some research and I actually found it pop up right on Amazon. So it is still being sold in some areas, but it is restricted in a few states, as you'll see in a couple slides from now. Recreation is another way for wide-scale dispersal of this plant. It can get caught up in boating equipment. Seeds can get pulled into ballast water and dumped into the next body of water that that boat is transported to. On a more local level, like I've said a couple times now, rhizomes are the most common way that this plant is spread. Fragmentation of the root system is also very common. Any disturbance to the roots and fragmentation, if any of that fragment gets downstream, it can easily infest a new area that was not infested. So water flow kind of goes into that as well. And then wildlife, I've got a little picture of a muskrat here because in a lot of my research I kept seeing that muskrats like to use parts of the plant for their homes. and they are one of the causes for further dispersal on a local level. So distribution, this species is reported in 26 states in the US. You can see in this bottom right picture from USGS, most of the infestations are found in the Northeast, and this plant is included in 10 states' invasive species laws as either a regulated or a prohibited plant. You can see on the left, this is from IMAP invasives. This is kind of the quick distribution of flowering rush in New York State, and it is considered usually between a tier 1 or a tier 2 species across the state if it's even ranked, meaning that it has been introduced to different regions, but it's not really at that end stage where we can't completely control it at this point. It's not completely out of hand. Some of the impacts, so similar to Chris, we both looked at the New York State invasiveness rank. This is a moderate species with a 63.75 ranking. Its ecological impacts is it's going to form dense stands, it can displace native species, and it can stagnate water flow. From my research, I've found that it doesn't really take over an entire area, but it just does cause a decent amount of disturbance. So it's not going to be like one of your aquatics like water chestnut, where it's going to completely take over an entire area and not allow any other native growth to happen. But it is going to have some impact on the area that it is growing in. Economic impacts. There's going to be a reduction in recreational opportunities, as I mentioned before, boating, fishing, and swimming. Once it kind of takes over an area and forms those dense stands, if there was those opportunities before, those are going to be not as available once this species is introduced. And it can also impact irrigation systems. You'll find it a lot of times in drainage ditches and irrigation ditches, and it can impact the distribution of the water through those systems. And then lastly, we have management for this species. Physical is probably the easiest for a small population, and there's a few different options for that. We have cutting. This is just removal of the plant. So it's often done by cutting the plant just below the surface of the water. This requires several cuttings per growing season to even be close to being effective. So it's very time consuming, and you have to be very meticulous with it because fragmentation can cause further infestations if that fragment moves to a different area that hasn't been infested in the past. And it doesn't kill the plant, but it will reduce the abundance for that season. Your next option is digging. So this is removal of the plant and you're removing the root system. This is more effective for smaller infestations, and it's going to reduce the population. And this, you really need to be careful with the root system and to not disturb it, because the fragmentation of those roots is going to cause an even bigger infestation, and it could cause an even bigger infestation right in that same area that you're working in. And then lastly, we have drawdown. An extensive reduction in water allowed to the plant can reduce the abundance as well. This isn't as common, but it is another option for physical management. And lastly, we have chemical. There's not a huge amount of information available on chemical control for this species, but most commonly it's a non-selective herbicide that has been used, and it's somewhat effective for seasonal control, but the big issue with this is it usually fails to kill the rhizomes, which is the main way for increasing the infestation for this plant. Another issue with chemical is the herbicide often washes off of the leaves because they're so narrow. You need to apply it multiple times for it to be somewhat effective. So usually the best way to do it is when the shoreline or the area that the plant is growing in is dry or the water is very low. That'll allow the most effective application and allow it to penetrate towards those rhizomes and kill that part of the plant, which is going to give you the best results. So that is flowering rush. That is how we can try to manage it, how you can identify it. And as always, we encourage people to report any plants they see through IMAP or any of the other systems for reporting invasives.
Thank you, Lauren and Chris.